Hello, everyone, and welcome to this second episode in our podcast mini-series. I'm discussing all things related to tricky partnership issues concerning partner underperformance, conflicts between partners, and derailing partners. In this episode, we'll be discussing the one with the squabbling partners. And we're going to do a deep dive into the common causes of disputes between partners and how these disputes typically manifest and how they can impact the firm's performance and team morale. We'll also explore effective resolution strategies and also preventative measures that firms can put in place and the role of governance in managing partner disputes effectively. And I'm joined by our special guest podcast contributors for this podcast series from consulting firm Urge International, Nick Jarrett-Kerr and Jonathan Middleburgh. So Nick, you're a recovering former managing partner of a leading UK law firm. And, and Nick now spends his time imparting the wisdom he's gained through his, I'm sure, lots of war stories and experience as a managing partner to international law firms across the globe on strategy, governance, and partner remuneration. And Jonathan is very interestingly, a qualified barrister as well as a qualified business psychologist, which to me seems like an amazing combination of skills, Jonathan. And Jonathan spends his time advising law firms on leadership coaching, leadership development, and conflict resolution between partners. And last but not least, I have my fellow partner, David Fisher. David is a guru in all things to do with partnership disputes, one of the leading partnership dispute litigators, and is really at the coalface of dealing with some of the issues that can arise from partner conflicts, and is one of the leading lawyers in this area in the UK. I'm Zulon Begum. I'm a partner at C.M. Murray. I specialise in advising professional services firms on non-contentious partnership issues, hopefully trying to avoid some of those kind of tricky issues that might arise through good policies and procedures and governance in partnership and LLP deeds and good structures to ensure that some of these issues can be avoided. I first wanted to mention, you may have already heard in the first episode in this series that Nick and Jonathan have co-edited a brilliant book on managing partner performance. And part of that involved doing quite a wide-ranging survey, some of which involved partner conflicts. Jonathan, was there anything coming out of that survey or also in your kind of wide experience as to what the common causes tend to be around partner disputes in law firms and professional services businesses?
Thanks, Zulon. And just to say, it's lovely to be back, and we very much enjoyed the first episode, and looking forward to this one. The survey covered a wide range of areas, so there wasn't really much of a deep dive on conflict. I think the thing that came out most from the survey was the relatively high instance of reported conflicts. I mean, I obviously, it's something I do quite a lot of, but I was surprised that around a quarter of respondents reported that they had their firms had used external help over the last 5 years to try to help resolve a conflict between partners. So, I was somewhat surprised at quite how high the reported instance was. In terms of the common causes, the survey didn't deep dive onto that so much, but I guess from my experience, the sort of typical things that I encounter again and again are probably in kind of three main buckets. I prefer to sort of think of them as conflicts rather than disputes. I tend to get involved at the kind of pre-dispute stage. So they arise in all sorts of ways, these kind of conflicts, but I see a lot of what I'd call sort of personality clash type disputes, where just partners just don't get on with each other for whatever reason. The second that I see a lot of is friction caused by what I'll call transition. So it's very often things like you've got a founder firm, and the founder is stepping back or wanting to step back, or the firm has matured and it's reached a point of inflection, and the partners want the founder to step back, and it just causes disruption. And the way the disruption often, or the unsettlement often manifests itself is in friction. That can be friction between the founder and the new managing partner. It can be between the founder and the new senior leadership team. That can quite often spark into a more serious conflict. And then the third area, which I see a lot of, is just plain old turf war, where you get the kind of issues around, I've got one practice area, you're treading on my toes, there's miscommunication with the client. The client's got specialized needs, you don't really understand it, your communication is crossing with mine, you're overstepping and dealing with my client. Yes, we're one firm, but it's kind of that sort of thing that I see a lot of.
And I agree with you, Sam. We see those types of conflicts as well. And I'd probably add maybe one more to that list would be where the firm is doing some, key changes within the business, whether that's changes to its remuneration structure or strategic direction, that can cause disconcert, concerns between partners and create different kind of factions. So we're always kind of navigating those issues, particularly when we're helping firms review their governance or their remuneration structures.
Yeah, and I suppose it's sort of similar to the transition thing. Any
Yeah,
kind of change or transition throws up, human beings don't like change too much.
yeah,
When change
exactly.
happens, that there's going to be some people who feel like they are under threat or they are potentially going to be losers, and then they react.
And David, on the dispute side, when you get involved, well, how do you often see these kind of disputes kind of manifesting between the partners, and what are the kind of key early warning signs that people should look out for?
Yeah, so it's usually a bit more subtle than things going sort of straight to a punch up in the pub after work. um, and I suppose as we sort of see in everyday life, really little signs that you can often pick up on in interactions between people. So it could be in a meeting, those little sort of those looks, those dismissive comments, sarcastic remarks between colleagues, or someone making derogatory remarks, to their colleagues about another partner. It's just normal, sort of natural human behaviour that sort of creeps in, and also particularly these days, of course, with so much being in writing, in emails, particularly. You can sort of often see these things just sort of bubbling up in the way that people are sending emails. Bits of aggression, those sort of slightly sort of rude comments, sort of things you wouldn't put in sort of necessarily in sort of a normal, friendly conversation, but something that's got a real sort of edge to it, and very interesting looking back, particularly when you're dealing with something that's developed into a dispute and you start looking at the documentation, and you can see the pattern building over time. I mean, one of the things that I can remember from being very very junior and working in what would now be regarded as quite a small firm, but you could often pick up and get to know what was going on around the place by talking to the person who ran the photocopying department, or the people who sort of see everything, and they always seem to know the gossip, knew the partners who didn't really get on because of the things that we picked up. Often, I think, just by looking around and talking to certain people, you can get a feel for what's going on in the place and where the disputes lie.
Yeah, it's always the chatter around the kind of wider group, isn't it? And the spillover effect on morale, where you might see some of the associates kind of talking about it or complaining about it or even leaving actually because they're not happy with the atmosphere between two partners or a group of partners. And those can be quite early warning signs that firms can pick up on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just as you say, it's those sort of things that maybe the partners themselves won't realise that what they're actually doing, because it's just sort of part of a normal behaviour, but other people around can pick up on it and see the signs.
Yeah, I mean, email can be a very poisonous tool. First of all, there can be unintentional miscommunication. People misread emails and perceive them as saying something they don't. But in any event, they're quite sort of dangerous because you get these kind of ping pong discussions
Yeah.
which escalate rather than just going and having a chat with each other. I've found in my experience in the past where I've been coaching people and I've been doing it remotely, and then I've visited their physical premises, and they're actually next door to each other, and they're never knocking on the door and having a chat. It's all being, proxy warfare by email.
And Nick, how do you kind of see these issues kind of affecting the overall performance of a team or even the actual firm? And we talked about kind of morale. How do you kind of often see that kind of manifesting in morale and how that can affect the performance of the firm itself?
To me, morale trumps spreadsheets every day of the week. Trumps, the bank balances, the growth in revenue of the firm or whatever. And I've got one very stark example of that from my experience as a consultant. And in fact, funny enough, I can name the firm because a book's been written about it. It's a Canadian firm called Heenan Blakey. I don't know whether that's ever come across that. And one of my partners in Edge and I were called in to do a strategic plan for them in 2013. So this is a few years ago. And when we got there, we thought, oh my word, what's going on here? And what had happened was that this was a firm that had grown hugely and had an office a main base in Toronto and another main base in Montreal, so French speaking versus English speaking. But one of the founder partners, a guy called Roy Heenan, been managing partner, he stood down about a year before we came in. And what the firm decided to do was to appoint co-managing partners, one from each region. And it all went horribly wrong. Those two partners, they got on quite well, but they were ineffective, ineffectual, and will come to governance later on. But the two sides were just at war with each other. We produced what effectively was a pretty decent crisis plan to get them through this period of instability when the firm had plateaued out and one or two partners had left. But actually, looking around the executive committee, their hearts weren't in it, their morale was low, they were more concerned about their own careers than the firm. And it wasn't long before some more people left and other partners left. And then in the middle of 2014, about 6 months or 8 months after we'd finished our assignment, the firm ceased to exist. And that was really morale rather than actual facts. It could have been turned around. It could easily have been turned around. It was a good firm. It had the ball basics there. But the human capital of the people who walk into the elevator in the morning and walk out at the end of the day, and if you haven't got them on side, you're lost.
Yeah, that's a very stark example, isn't it? Thank you for sharing that with us. And we see lots of examples like that, not kind of necessarily leading to the dissolution of the firm, but certainly kind of breakup of teams and major fallouts at the board level. I mean, I've had two members of the board fall out, and eventually, one of the very senior people in the business had to exit, which was a huge shame. Another example where two partners in a team have fallen out, and that's literally kind of disintegrated that team in the firm, and so it has a huge impact on kind of internal morale and the business itself. Jonathan, you mentioned you're kind of a bit more upstream than perhaps maybe David is when getting involved in these disputes. But so once kind of say the management has spotted some of these early warning signs, how can they kind of effectively manage it so that it doesn't get to a dispute going to David, for example?
Yeah, or the Nick example, which is obviously the extreme example, and mercifully rare, but not unheard of. I think the starting point is always conversation. I mean, that sounds fairly basic. If I'm involved or I'm trying to help somebody figure out how to deal with things. I think if it's one partner who is clashing with many others, and really the issue seems to be about that partner and their behaviours, I think it's often about trying to dial up the self-awareness of the partner. I think sometimes It's helpful to get some 360 feedback for the partner, because they may be unaware of their style and their impact on others. Some lawyers have really quite low emotional intelligence and low self-awareness. I think then, from that, and more generally, focusing on what behaviours really need to change, spotlighting the kind of unhelpful behaviours, and focusing on what changed or new behaviours to work on and develop. I think it can often be very helpful having a wise senior partner, or trusted colleague, who can kind of metaphorically put their arm around the person and give them behavioral feedback in the right way, and just help gently coach them through more productive ways of interacting with other people. Quite often, individuals are in denial about their own role. I think, when it becomes about two or more partners, um, again, I think it's about conversation. I think it's about trying to find out what is underlying this conflict. What is the cause? Is it something more behavioural? Is it a conflict about something substantive? If it's behavioural, how do you try and get the partners to modify their behaviours to interact together more productively? Sometimes it's less frequent, but sometimes one person just doesn't fit in, and really it's about trying to figure out a way to for that person to step away without having the kind of meltdown scenario that Nick described. If it's something substantive, is there a middle ground? What might be a win-win solution for each of the partners? It's that kind of thing.
And I guess it also kind of has a flow through effect on everything, from kind of how you recruit your partners, how you promote them, what kind of criteria you put in place, how do you develop, the development of partner leadership skills, and also the annual appraisal processes.
We touched on this yesterday. We were talking with Claire Murray about lateral hiring and the importance of getting laterals properly integrated, and really, spending time up front, having a senior person who kind of helps them acculturate to the firm, kind of recognizing that it's difficult for everyone. It's difficult for the incoming partner, who might come from a firm with a widely or vastly different culture, to kind of read the runes. Sometimes there are kind of unspoken ground rules which you just don't know, and having somebody who knows the ropes kind of mentor you through this can be very, very helpful.
And if it does kind of get to a further stage, and you can't nip it in the bud through some of those strategies, Jonathan, that you mentioned, but if it gets to second or third level conflict, how can firms kind of manage it at that stage? Is it through mediation or some other kind of method?
Yeah, so that could well work depending on the nature of the issue. And it may just be by bringing in someone who's seen as being a bit more sort of independent in a way, to try to work out a solution, and just as people might do with sort of relationship counselling or something of that nature, to try and work forward positively. So that may well work, or at least bring out more of what the issues are, and hopefully lead to some sort of solution. Obviously, there will be plenty of cases where that just won't work, or the parties involved don't want to really engage in that. Firms will often reach a position where some more sort of drastic action needs to be taken to try and sort of resolve this issue. Particularly if it's sort of perceived that there is one individual who's more the sort of the cause of the problem than the other. Obviously, that's a very difficult issue for a firm to deal with, particularly if they're looking at someone who's very productive, who produces a lot of revenue for the firm and so on. Often the decision will be made that really the only way to move forwards here, and to, for the good of the firm generally, is to try and manage one of the parties out in a way, if that's really seen to be the only way that things can be dealt with. And then lots of issues really will flow from that potentially. Partners, LLP members, they don't have unfair dismissal rights like an ordinary employee would, but there's still sort of plenty of potential claims that could come out of this depending on how the thing is handled. And some of the things the firm will really need to take care of is to make sure that they're not discriminating against one of the partners. So if there are two partners sort of in a dispute and they decide to manage one of them out, is there a risk that the partner who is forced out can say that this is unlawful discrimination on some sort of protected characteristic, sort of sex, race, disability, age, and so on? Or has there been some sort of issue that could give rise to an allegation of whistleblowing in some way? So has there been something raised by a partner that might be, say, of regulatory concern? They've made a protected disclosure, and the firm is then acting in a way that's detrimental to them. That could open up potential whistleblowing claims. Lots of potential problems there for the firm. It needs to be very careful how those sorts of issues are dealt with. And even just in a shall we say, a slightly more straightforward case where there might not even be any suggestion or possibility of unlawful discrimination or whistleblowing, still making sure that things are handled properly. If the firm's got processes and sort of procedures in place for dealing with partner problems, that it adheres to those and really gives the partner concerned a fair opportunity to try and get this resolved. They're not just sort of thrown out immediately with no opportunity to have this sort of sorted out in the way. So lots of disputes can flow from those sorts of things, and obviously typically these days I think anyone put in that position is going to try to get some advice early on, and then next thing the firm knows, it's sort of locked into a dispute with lawyers for the partner concerned. So it gets very messy potentially.
And where it's not simply a clash of personalities, for example, where there is some real complaint from one partner to the other, and usually it can escalate into cross complaints between partners, the firm needs to tread quite carefully to ensure that those complaints are dealt with appropriately, whether that might mean they need to investigate those complaints and go through a proper process around that, and whether that might actually result in some kind of disciplinary process, because otherwise it can leave the firm itself open to claims against those individuals against the firm. It can be quite a quagmire, unfortunately, these types of issues. So the firms need to kind of tread quite carefully as to how they handle these issues between partners. Coming to you, Nick, what kind of other measures can firms put in place in order to kind of prevent these issues happening or escalating, in your experience, do you think? I mean, hopefully to avoid things like the Canadian dissolution that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, it's not an easy one, Zulon, because how can you prevent people falling out with each other? It's part of human nature. A situation where partners are kind of godparents to each other's children, it no longer takes the place, but there has to be some glue between them, and so that it's important that there should be some cultural glue between the partners if you can make it. I think at a more process end, what I've seen firms being able to do is to have a sort of framework that details the sort of behaviors that they expect of partners and the sort of behaviors that are unacceptable, and to be able to hold partners to account for that at a very early stage. That seems to work to some extent. You can never prevent disputes. It just is not possible. But if you're trying to head things off early, culture is important, trying to get the firm to a place where people understand and bond together and have some glue between them, and process and behavior management is also important.
I completely agree. Having those kind of key expectations around partner behavior is absolutely crucial, because otherwise if you don't have something to point to, you can't actually say to a partner, well, you're not really living the firm's values
Sure.
and expectations around partner leadership. And that makes it difficult. I completely agree around the culture point. And those kind of expectations are very closely related to culture. And also communication between partners. You mentioned the godparent point, but how can kind of firms ensure that there is that open communication and collaboration between partners? Because that can often ensure that you don't have these kind of frictions arising.
There is the sort of, I mean, if we're going on to godparents and things like that, there's the not in the front of children point. So to try to make sure that partners have it very clearly in mind that if they're in a meeting with associates and juniors and so on, secretaries, anybody who's not a partner, that any disagreement they have is not showing up, that's kept private between them, because they have to present the united front of the firm, and that needs to be embedded in the whole ethos and the way of doing things in the firm. How you do that, I think that's a leadership point more than a process point.
And I talked in the introduction about some of the governance structures that firms can put in place to, again, kind of head off some of these issues. I mean, what I often see and would recommend is actually having somebody in the leadership team dedicated to partner pastoral issues effectively, because often managing partners can be very busy at the coalface dealing with the day-to-day management and operations of the business, and may not have an ear to the ground as to what's happening with individual partners. And sometimes that can be senior partner, chairman role, or some other person within the senior leadership team. Well, what do you see, Nick, in terms of kind of having governance structures in place to kind of ensure partner issues are dealt with quickly and effectively?
I think that clear delineation between someone like the chairman or senior partner and those involved in management, managing partner, CEO, whatever, is important, and that there should be someone who is, so to speak, trustee for the partnership, that is able to step in and deal with partner relationships, and that I see as absolutely vital. I think going back to Heenan Blakey, one of the things that affected that case was a weak governance structure. The decision-making process was highly flawed. So that resulted in a great stultifying of any decent decision-making. And that only led to people becoming more disaffective and voting with their feet. So getting the governance structure correct so that decisions can be made quite reasonably, whatever voting structure you have with reserved majorities and so on, whatever seems right for the firm is vital. They didn't have that in Heenan Blakey, and that was one of the causes of their demise, in my view. By the way, I'm only mentioning Heenan Blakey because the book's been written about it, so I feel free to be able to mention the name, which is very rare for us consultants to be able to mention clients we've worked on.
I completely agree. It's very hard to kind of talk about real life examples, unfortunately. But yeah, that's a really helpful point. And on decision making, I'd also say that you have to have structures in place that gives confidence to partners that their views are being represented, whether that's through directly elected people on the management board making decisions, or especially on the remuneration board, because remuneration is often an issue of friction between partners. So ensuring that you have a fair, transparent and trusted remuneration structure and process in place is really key to ensuring that you don't create any discontent or bad blood between partners because they think it's an unfair process. And I just wanted to come on to the last point in our discussion, is kind of how do those kind of partner conduct and expectations policies kind of play in managing the disputes itself. Jonathan and David, you will have experience of these things actually going to a dispute or a potential dispute, and how you think those kind of policies and expectations can actually help in order to kind of manage that kind of dispute process.
Guess I'll probably defer to David on that one. I mean, as you said earlier, Zulon, I tend to get involved a bit upstream, and we talked a little bit about having expectations policies or rules of conduct, and how they can be somewhat helpful in setting expectations. But as Nick said, human beings are human beings, and you're going to get conflict. You try and resolve that, and then sometimes you fail, and then you get downstream to a David who is faced with the actual dispute, and I'm sure we'll speak to the benefit of processes and so on at that stage.
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. See, having something there that sets out the way that people should behave, just as you do for employees generally, it might have some impact to some degree if people stop and think, or shown some sort of policy and examples of the types of behaviour that aren't tolerated. But in reality, it is more about using them somewhere down the line when a problem has arisen. And when we're talking about partners, often it is a firm wanting to take some action, very often wanting to remove a partner, and at least having something to point to say that whilst they don't, strictly speaking, necessarily need to show that there's been a breach of some policy to remove a partner in lots of cases, having something there to say, look, this is what everyone's signed up to, this is where your behaviour has fallen down, there's clear cause for us to be able to remove you, even if they are negotiating an exit rather than just removing a partner by management discretion or by a vote. It typically will help in that negotiation. The converse of that is that if you don't have any policies in place, it's certainly more challenging to be able to say that you've fallen short in this respect and you've been in breach of the LLP agreement or whatever it might be. So yeah, certainly having something there, some good clear policy, is definitely advisable, and may go some way towards preventing some of these problems in the first place. But yeah, definitely useful down.
I just wanted to round off our brilliant conversation with just kind of giving the listeners maybe some top tip that you would advise firms to kind of do or have in place in order to kind of help them manage these types of conflicts or prevent them. Nick, what would your top tip be?
I think apart from the governance issues that we've mentioned, the main thing is to try to get things from people's heads to their hearts. And one way of doing that is to have a partner code that you get partners to sign. This is separate from the partners agreement or members agreement or whatever it may be, but just a code of values that partners should stick to and actually get them to sign it. I found that helps.
That's a really good tip. Thank you, Nick. And Jonathan?
Good leadership always starts from the top, cascades downwards. So, I think your idea of having, someone senior leadership who's pastorally responsible, but managing partner, senior leadership team, they all need to set the culture, and the way they behave and their openness to feedback and so on. That will determine whether you have an open culture or whether things are less likely to be open.
And lastly, David.
Yeah, I'd say that not to let things drift, but grasp the nettle where issues arise. Otherwise, problems just get bigger and bigger, and it becomes more part of the culture that partners are always fighting, and you end up in a series of disputes. So take some action early on, and get some advice early on as well if you think you might need it.
End up in the death spiral that Nick described earlier.
Yeah, sorry about that one.
Brilliant. Well, thank you all so much, Nick and Jonathan and David, for the excellent conversation. I hope our listeners enjoyed it as much as I did, and thank you to our listeners as well for staying the course. And I hope you found it interesting and enjoyable. And hope you'll join us for the third in the series, which will be coming out soon, and that will be on the one with a derailing partner, where Jonathan and Nick will be joining us again. And if you missed our first episode, it was a brilliant listen, and it's the one on the underperforming law firm, and that's already available on our website if you'd like to have a listen to that one. So thank you all again, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you soon. And if you have any questions or about what's been discussed on today's podcast, please don't hesitate to get in touch with any one of us. Thank you all very much.